for joining us for the panel today. And I'd also like to echo Alex and Daniel's sentiments from earlier. So we will dive right in. Again, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. That will be monitored throughout our conversation today. So diving right in, John Ehrlichman was an advisor to President Nixon, and he outlined a political strategy to associate marijuana with hippies and heroin with Blacks. And he sought to penalize both of those quite heavily. This allowed authorities to arrest civil rights leaders, raid homes, break up meetings, and vilify the marginalized on the nightly news by knowingly reporting false drug reports. So we're going to start with Dr. Rooks. What steps can news and media corporations take to reverse African Americans' vilification and criminalization?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. Hopefully you all can hear my volumes coming in all right. So I teach a lot of classes about inequality and especially race in the sociology department. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation. I think it's always been important to talk about race, and there's no time like the present to get this conversation started. So I think this is a really interesting question about the role of the news and media corporations to reverse these longstanding trends in vilification and dehumanization and negative representation that the movie, I think, so dramatically and so brilliantly articulates. But I guess I would start by saying, why would we expect corporations or trust them to do this? And, you know, corporations have a set of interests and goals that are at best different and at worst in stark opposition to the types of social reform that the movie really calls for. I think there was some really interesting examples in the movie of corporations playing an important role in profiting from and pushing for mass incarceration in the United States. So I'm a little skeptical that change will come from corporate entities, especially those in media. And I have a few thoughts about this, and then I'll hand things over to Courtney or the next question, however we're doing this. So there are certainly progressive corporations. There's a lot of interest and emphasis put on B corporations today and sort of companies that pursue the triple bottom line. But these are not the kinds of corporations that are really, for the most part, affecting the media landscape in the United States. And they're not the kind of corporations that are proposing legislation through entities like ALEC, which the movie talked about, but also the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, who have played a big role in perpetuating some of the social issues that were talked about in the movie. And certainly there are corporations and media corporations that celebrate diversity and talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King. But there's a big difference between doing those kind of things and actually pushing for meaningful social reform around mass incarceration. And I think in particular to the media, the movie did a really nice job in sort of showing how the media, in particular the news media, has perpetuated the criminalization and dehumanization of African Americans. I was thinking about other examples when I was watching the movie of this too, and the way in which Hollywood depictions of crime and criminals and law enforcement have been deeply racialized in a problematic way. So I was thinking about all the positive portrayals of white law enforcement that exist in the media. And then I was thinking about these examples of TV shows or movies that really focus on whitewashed portrayals of prison life, that sort of focus a white protagonist in prison and make that person sort of a sympathetic character. And I think really skewing our understanding of mass incarceration in the United States in an important way. Like I was thinking about TV shows like Oz or Escape from Dannemora or Prison Break or Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where the main character is sort of this sometimes lovable, but if not lovable, sometimes sympathetic white person who's stuck in prison. And so I think there are lots of examples of the media and corporate media in particular playing a role in this problem and really shaping our views about mass incarceration in very deeply problematic ways. And so I'm really skeptical that that's where the change is going to come in the United States. I'll say one last thing, then I'll stop talking. sometimes when people look at the media, they focus on how the media shapes audience views about social issues and groups. And I think that's certainly true. But it's also true that the media is reflecting a view of society that they think that viewers want and agree with. And so I think until we interrupt that and we really change Americans' understanding of mass incarceration and race, and then force the media to reflect that changed view, that's where the change is going to happen. But I don't really think it's going to come from corporations themselves.
Thank you. Commissioner Smith, do you have any other examples of, how America's understanding of African Americans in crime have been shaped?
Sure. So I wanted to thank you for inviting me, especially BLSA. I was a BLSA member at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, so I'm super excited to talk to other Black law students. Some other examples that I can think of right now, I'm so glad that Daniel mentioned the protest that happened last summer in response to the horrible killing of George Floyd. That in itself was a very recent example of the demonization of Black people and people who protested in response to George Floyd's killing. Our former president, Trump, decided to take a law and order stance against people who went out and protested. People were rallied up. People were incarcerated as a result of their participation in these marches, especially in Kentucky and in Texas. So this demonization of Black people continues to show today. One example that 13th gave that was really great was talking about Birth of a Nation, released in 1915, and the portrayal of Black men as predators and as rapists, and how that worked to perpetuate these stereotypes that exist about Black people. And in particular, it worked to increase membership in the Ku Klux Klan. So those are some immediate examples I can think of how the media's portrayal of Black people demonizes us and causes us to become overrepresented in the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Dr. Rooks, how might sociologists suggest addressing these instances of racism and dehumanization?
Thank you. Well, I think I'll say one thing and then I have some ideas. I think that it's important to understand, and I think the movie does a nice job articulating this, that much of what we're seeing in the criminal justice system reflects deep fear and anxiety held by white people about a number of things. About Black and brown people, especially men, about anxiety about being overpowered or outnumbered in American society. And so to me, any solution that tries to get at this system of mass incarceration and this dehumanization has to address that fear and anxiety. And that white people really need to do that work themselves. And so when I think about what can we do to address racism and dehumanization, I'm like, yes, education and awareness is important, but so is what I would call interruption. White people committing to interrupting racism and discrimination whenever they hear it and see it and are around it. And so I think what that looks like is it looks like everyone educating themselves about these dynamics as much as possible. It looks like white people, especially when they're in predominantly white or white-only settings, interrupting racism and discrimination whenever they're around it and really committing to that as part of their anti-racist practice. It's about, especially white people, but everybody, acknowledging that just because they haven't experienced something doesn't mean it's not true, or just because they don't interpret a situation a certain way doesn't mean that it's not legitimate to interpret that way. And I guess the understanding that even if you don't intend for your actions or words to be discriminatory, that they certainly can be, and they can be perceived that way by other people. Intention matters, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. And I guess the last thing that I would say is it's really important, especially for white people, to recognize that they have a race, that their race is white. White people, all the time when you ask them what their race is, they're like, oh, I'm German. And you're like, that's your ethnicity. Your race is white. White people should not ignore their own race and the way that it shapes their worldview and how others treat them, and should not assume that you know the race of other people around you or that they're going to agree with certain statements that you make about being a member of a certain group. So I just think there needs to be a tremendous amount more awareness and education among white people about the dynamics of race, and that it's really up to those of us who are white to do that work and not ask people of color to educate us or do it for us, and to really interrupt with each other when we hear and see examples of discrimination. So I know it's kind of cheesy to be like education, but I'm like education, awareness, and interruption. That's what I would say.
Okay, education, awareness, and interruption. Thank you. So the mental health implications on society are monumental when we're discussing mass incarceration's impact on society as a whole. For instance, the trauma associated with breaking up families, re-entry into society, and the entire world essentially witnessing and experiencing the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Commissioner Smith, how is the Montana Racial Equity Project involved in rehumanizing or extending equity and equality for people of color?
Well, the Montana Racial Equity Project is the only Black-led, all BIPOC staff nonprofit organization in the state of Montana. A lot of the work that we do focuses on centering people's stories, their personal histories. And so I think part of rehumanizing what it means for equality in the state of Montana is actually filtering through those stories and those calls in order to inform what policy changes we want in the state of Montana, and to work with the legislature to advance those policies that we think are equitable. That's what I'm most proud of in my role as the Criminal Justice Initiative lead here in Bozeman. And I think that those personal stories and getting those out to people instead of just coming up with ideas for people of color, having people of color lead these discussions is incredibly important in making sure that equity is put at the forefront.
If you could leave people with one thing that they can do as an individual to be part of the solution, and this is for both panelists, is there one kind of nugget or tidbit that you would leave us as individuals watching the panel, how they can be a part of the solution?
I really liked Daisy's education piece. 13th is incredibly educational and taking you from slavery all the way to the current day on how these issues continue to be perpetuated in our criminal justice system. And I think educating yourself on issues of race, educating yourself on what it means to be an anti-racist, and actually putting that into practice are practical things that everyone can do in order to help the situation.
Agreed. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add.
The abolishment of slavery in America meant free labor was, no longer existed, and plantations who enslaved Africans needed to find other ways to reduce costs. Commissioner Smith, what role can corporations play to improve economic equality imbalanced by mass incarceration?
I would say the first thing that corporations can do is choose not to be a part of the system that continues to allow for imprisoned individuals to work for pennies on the dollar. One example that comes straight out of Montana is Gelt Belts. It's a company that is supposed to be environmentally friendly. They use recycled bottles to make their belts, but they also utilize prison labor from the women's prison. And they pay these individuals between 40 and 85 cents an hour. Most of that money is taken back by the prison in order to pay for their stay there. And so corporations like this continue to perpetuate the problems of inequality and really another form of slavery into modern day.
Thank you. Dr. Rooks, what is the relationship between the labor market and the criminal justice system? Is cheap labor a catalyst for that relationship?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting and important question. And I think the movie does a really nice job explaining how appetite for cheap or free labor has shaped the history of the criminal justice system in the United States in profound ways. I want to say a little bit about what happens to people after they get out of prison and try to re-enter the labor market. The movie touched on this a little bit, but this is an area where there's really robust sociological research that examines the impact of what sociologists would call a criminal credential, having a mark, a significant mark on your record, impacts people's ability to seek employment. One of the leading researchers on this topic is a woman who named Diva Pager, Pager, and she actually died very young a few years ago, but she conducted a whole range of studies that were sort of what are called experimental audit design studies, where she would have people with the same resume, trained in the same way, wearing the same clothes, going out and applying for jobs. Half of them white, half of them African American, half of each of those groups had a criminal credential and half didn't. And she found that having a criminal credential really hurts your ability to get called back for a job. But her findings around race were even more stark. She found that African Americans without the criminal credential in her study were less likely than whites with a criminal credential to get called back. So this is her biggest version of the study, came out in 2003. It's called The Mark of a Criminal Record. And it was a really brilliant study that raised the question, what is it that is hurting African Americans in the labor market? Is it an actual criminal credential, or is it a racist perception on the part of employers that if you're Black, you have a criminal credential in some way? So I think there are a lot of really interesting related issues around employment, quality of employment, wages, that formerly incarcerated have a different access to those things than people that were in the system. But sociologists like Diva Pager ask, is it possible that in our country, race for some groups is being associated with criminality and is actually hurting people's access to the labor market, whether or not they've been part of the criminal justice system? So if it's true that that's happening and that many employers have these deep stereotypes about African-American job seekers, then that means that the negative consequences of mass incarceration are in fact much more insidious and much deeper than even the movie presents them to be.
Thank you. In the chat, we did have a question to share any resources for women. So I'm going to ask both panelists to kind of think on that as we move through the rest of the panel. So slavery was one of America's original sins. The 13th Amendment clearly prohibited slavery, but it also etched out another way to control African Americans. National policies like the war on drugs and law and order have shaped how many Americans think about poverty, African Americans, justice, and many other areas. Thinking broadly about social movements, labor movements, legislation, education, constitutional amendments, do we have any options to kind of change that thinking broadly? And I will pose this to both panelists.
I'm doing the thing where I'm avoiding eye contact, like people do in class when they don't want to answer the question. It's a great question. It's really big. Courtney, do you want to go first?
Well, whoever decides to go first, I will tell you that you are able to take whichever chunk of the question is most beneficial for you.
I could say something brief, and then I'm really interested to hear what Courtney has to say. I think there's some really hopeful examples in this arena. I think the Ban the Box initiative that really has rolled out across the country in important ways, banning that question about your arrest record or conviction record from job applications where it's not relevant, could be a really important piece of the puzzle. I study labor unions and work, so this question about labor movements is really a complicated one when you're talking about mass incarceration and the criminal justice system, because the role that many unions have played in pushing for economic and social justice versus the role that criminal justice unions have played, it's just a really stark contrast. And I can say more in the Q&A if people want me to, but I look at things like Ban the Box initiatives, and I'm really quite hopeful about them as a way to change some of the negative long-term effects of mass incarceration.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a minute, but some of the things that the Montana Racial Equity Project are currently working on, we're a member of what's called the Public Safety Coalition here in the state of Montana. We work with a lot of groups, including the ACLU, Western Native Voice, and also the Chamber of Commerce, Americans for Prosperity, to try to work across party lines to come up with criminal justice reforms that we think are going to be effective. One of those pieces of legislation that we're working on is a Rehabilitation Certificate. So those who are formerly incarcerated can apply for this certificate through their local court. And once it's awarded, it'll say essentially that this person has met the requirements to be employable. So hopefully that will overcome some of the stigmas, although I don't know if the racial component is fully addressed by that type of legislation. We also are working on some mental health issues surrounding incarceration and resources for those who have been formerly incarcerated that deal with mental health. So that's really where we are working in the legislature to try to push for greater equality within the criminal justice system, and especially once people get out. A lot of people are, there's a lot of recidivism around probation and parole violations here in the state of Montana. So most people, it's a resource issue. I can't make it to this appointment, therefore I violated my parole conditions and now I'm reincarcerated. So making sure that there are resources available to people who are impoverished and don't have the ability to meet those requirements, and making sure those requirements aren't so overwhelming that you cannot overcome all of the hurdles and barriers to being a full participant in society.
Thank you. Don't mute yourself just yet, because I do have a follow-up question for you, Commissioner Smith. In the chat box, someone asked, are there any pieces of legislation that you would like to see both in Montana and hopefully nationwide that would address racism and inequity?
The biggest piece of legislation that we would like to see in the future, this year, I think it's being brought as a study bill, is simply data that's missing. There's a lot of data related to race and who's actually in the system that just doesn't exist, especially in smaller parts of Montana. So a statewide system that promotes transparency and data collection, especially on issues related to race, so that everyone can see in the state how we're doing as far as racial disparities are concerned, both locally within the state and nationally.
I will pose this next question to Dr. Rooks. Is our country compelled to repay these communities and families in a more material and restorative way? And I'll end that with a why or why not.
I guess my short answer is yes. And then I would really recommend for people that haven't read it to read the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece, The Case for Reparations. He makes the argument in a much smarter and more sophisticated way than I ever would. I think one thing just to be aware of is that there certainly are many documented, demonstrable financial costs of mass incarceration on African Americans in particular. But I think we also just want to be aware of the emotional cost, from historical trauma to mental health. The movie covered this pretty nicely. But I think sometimes when we think about reparations, we're thinking about economic harm and then an economic restoration or material restoration. And I think it's an important step, but really would not address a lot of these other problems as well. So I will, at the very end, I'll put some information in. I just was talking to a colleague in the social work department on campus, Jen Malloy, and she's running a 3-session restorative justice workshop for graduate students this spring that I think a lot of law students might be interested in, really trying to think about what would restorative justice look like here in Montana. And that might be another way to address not the same issue, but related issues as well.
I did go on ahead and source that article and put that in the chat box. So if anyone has not read it and they're interested in it, you're able to just click that and it takes you directly to the Atlantic article. But as a follow-up, Commissioner Smith, I'll pose the same question. What are your thoughts on reparations? Why or why not?
I would agree that we're absolutely equipped to give reparations to people who've suffered harm. I will say quickly that I have a friend whose mother was incarcerated during the 1980s when there was a huge disparity for those convicted of crack cocaine versus marijuana. She grew up without her mother for 15 years of her life because of it. And that type of social harm stems directly from the legacies of slavery. And those types of things are instances in which someone should be compensated for the wrongs that are done by the United States government, especially because that's not so far removed from where we are today. So I would say that we're definitely equipped. I think Asheville, North Carolina recently decided to give reparations in the form of programs and encouraging business ownership for Black people, educational programs for Black people. So reparations looks different to different people, but it's definitely an option that we should pursue.
So we do have another participant question. How do we find out if a company is using prison labor? Is there, a site that sources all of this information for us? How do we as a consumer kind of separate, the good companies versus the bad companies?
That's a great question. I'm sure there is a website, and maybe I will try to find one for you all after this. But being aware of where your products come from is incredibly important. I know that there are online resources. I was able, we've been in talks with BLSA, I guess, to encourage them to use other forms of labor. So that's how I knew. And there was even an article that they kind of where online that they've been engaging in this. So research is important, and I will try to find a resource for that.
Thank you. By way of follow-up, I will say that someone went on their website and shared, that they on their website, they're saying that they moved manufacturing from China to the United States. Our belts are now manufactured in Montana, USA, by talented women living in rural areas around the state. So that is much nicer than saying they are manufactured by incarcerated women in the state of Montana. So as a consumer, you know, we can definitely do a little bit more. An additional participant question is, how do we talk to someone about race who might think differently? So I'll pose that first to Dr. Rooks and then allow Commissioner Smith follow up.
I would hope that everybody would engage in conversations about race with people that, in general, and I find myself every day in conversations with people about race where they have different opinions. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're really educated about the history of race, about the history of racial discrimination and inequality, but equally important about the history of white privilege in the United States, because a lot of our education about race in the US focuses on cumulative disadvantage that people of color have experienced, especially African Americans in the US. There's a parallel cumulative advantage that whites have benefited from in the United States. And a lot of times that's not part of the conversation or the discussion. And so I know there are many folks on campus here at the University of Montana who are excited about these topics and teach about them and are really passionate about them. I think for students, seek out those faculty and seek out those classes, and first get a firm grip on the history and on the contemporary situation, and then definitely engage people, especially if you're white, and especially if you have people in your social circle, your family, your community, your neighbors. I think having those fact-based, evidence-based conversations about the legacy of racism in our country is hugely important. Those conversations are not going to be comfortable. They're not going to be easy. And I think it's an important thing that especially white people can do, is to engage each other in uncomfortable conversations about race. So I don't know that I really answered how to do it, but don't, I would say, especially to white people, don't shy away from it just because it's uncomfortable. That's really being part of the problem.
I would agree with Professor Rooks, but I would also add that the Montana Racial Equity Project does have workshops specifically on how to speak about race, how to talk to kids about race, what it means to be anti-racist. But I would also add that the onus is on white people, and they should call each other out when they see things that are racist and they hear things that are racist, and maybe even ask questions like, why do you believe that? What is that based in? Who told you this about this group of people? And questioning and pushing back on someone's beliefs definitely helps to open the conversation on why you believe the things that you do.
One of my good friends says that my tell whenever I'm entering one of those conversations is that I'm always like, oh, that's so interesting. Now, and then I sort of transition into another thing. I wasn't really aware of it until she pointed it out, but yeah.
So we have another participant question, and this is for Commissioner Smith. They ask, can you tell us what it was like being a civil rights attorney in Arkansas, and was there any particular case or ruling that stood out to you?
That was interesting, especially as a Black female. So one case in particular, I suppose, that stuck out to me, we definitely had an increase in employment discrimination claims in 2016, which I don't think was coincidental. I had one pretty egregious case in which someone hung a noose, a white person hung a noose in a Black person's workstation, called him derogatory names that I won't repeat. Racial stereotypes were hurled at him. And so being able to represent him was one of my favorite cases that I ever got to do, because it was just so blatantly racist and discriminatory. And I was happy to work on that type of employment discrimination claim.
Thank you for sharing that experience. So in the 70s and 80s, the national dialogue was primarily about fighting a war on drugs. Now the national conversation seems to shift to the opioid epidemic, and that shift has changed the lens to a more empathetic and less combative view on how we help those with drug addictions. How should we interpret this shift, and what can we learn, and what can we potentially do different in the future? So I'll start with Dr. Rooks.
It's hard because I think the approach that the media and the medical community and the criminal justice system has taken to the opioid epidemic is the right approach for the most part. But I think the fact that we as a society have responded to the opioid epidemic totally differently than we did to the crack epidemic is just a sign of deeply entrenched institutionalized racism in our country. I mean, on the one hand, I'm furious about it. And on the other hand, I'm like, yes, this is a medical problem that we should address with medical support and rehab and resources, and try to divert people out of the criminal justice system when they clearly have addiction problems. But to me, it's no surprise at all that this is how we treat an epidemic that has largely ravaged white communities. I mean, the other parallel, I was very obsessed with this. I moved to Montana in 2009, and it was the height of all the Pirates of the Caribbean enthusiasm. And this was my shtick at parties for like 2 years. People got really sick of it. I was like, why is it that we hate and vilify the Somali pirates and we love Pirates of the Caribbean? Like, it's racism. And I really think that is at the core of what we're seeing in this difference. I forgot what the question was because I'm so mad about this issue. I'm sorry.
It was, how do we interpret this shift in thinking between the war on drugs and the opioid epidemic? And then what can we learn and how to do this differently should we encounter this in the future?
Yeah, I'm like, racism. I don't know. I'll hand the floor over to Courtney.
I definitely agree. It's racist, and I think it should have always been treated as a mental health issue. And like you pointed out, hopefully going forward, we'll continue to treat this as a mental health issue. But this is another example of why reparations are important for people who suffered harm under our former policies. There's still a disparity in sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine that exists. It's not 100 to 1 anymore. I think it's 13 to 1 now, but it's still a disparity that affects the racial makeup of our prison population.
So I'm going to pose this next question to you both, but I will start with Commissioner Smith. Do you have any tips on how to address racism in the classroom? And that would be for professors as well as students.
You know, that's a great question. We do have a program called How to Talk to Kids About Race. It starts with elementary school students, and we have an education lead with our nonprofit organization. But I personally don't know very many students of color who've attended a predominantly white institution that haven't experienced some form of what they have called microaggression or racial discrimination, either from fellow students or teachers and professors. So I definitely think it's a problem that needs to be addressed. I think professors and teachers need to take the lead in calling out these racist incidents when they happen and dealing with them swiftly and learning how to communicate with students of color.
Yeah, I like all of those ideas. teaching about race as a white person in a predominantly white institution is a really different experience than I was trained for at UCLA, which is a university with a totally different demographic population of students. I think it's important to look at empirical evidence. I think it's important to also expose students to narrative discussions of discrimination and racism. I think Courtney, in one of her first comments, was sort of listening to people of color in Montana and taking their stories seriously, and centering those narratives is a big part of what her organization does. There's some great research out there that really explores what it's like to be a BIPOC person in the United States and confront discrimination. And I think all students should expose themselves both to the data and the hard numbers, but also to the stories and narrative. One of my favorite pieces along this line in sociology is this piece called The Continuing Significance of Race by Joe Fegan in 1991. And it's based on a series of over 100 interviews with middle-class Black professionals in the US, talking about their experience confronting discrimination. And one of his arguments is that African Americans develop what he calls a second eye, a very specific way of interpreting interactions based on their history being Black in America, and that whites don't have this second eye. And so whites and African Americans in particular experience and interpret interactions really differently. And I think the more you can expose students to this kind of narrative understanding of race and racism, regardless of what their race is themselves, the better. And I think the last thing is for faculty to know that race is an emotional, complex topic for everyone that's learning about it. And you have to have those soft skills and those interpersonal skills to help students manage their emotional response to the material. If you do not have feelings when you're talking about race, then you're doing it wrong. You're not paying attention, whatever those feelings are.
So we have an additional question here. We've seen how powerful fear is as a national political motivator. Birth of a Nation, Willie Horton, etc. How do people who want to confront systematic racism neutralize the power of messages of fear? So I will pose that to both of you, and we'll start with Dr. Rooks.
I think white fear and white anxiety is at the heart of a lot of the policies that we've seen that affect mass incarceration. And so I think the first step is to acknowledge that and to really try to understand what that fear is. And then for white people to confront that fear with each other. I mean, there's a lot made of this date 2025 when, not 2025, what is it, 2052? Where whites will become the statistical minority in the US. Why am I stumbling on this date? Somebody can put it in the chat if they know what I'm talking about. And I think really whites are deeply afraid of not being the majority in terms of numbers, and then wondering if that's going to mean that they're not going to be the majority in terms of power and influence. And that's a real fear and needs to be, I mean, not real, like legitimate 2045, thank you. But that's something that really needs to be explored and talked about and debunked. And whites, I mean, in my personal opinion, they need to get over it. That's what needs to happen. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but.
Commissioner Smith.
I agree with Professor Rooks. I don't know that I have much more to add on the topic, but a lot of that anxiety has to do with what's happening in our country demographically. And, you have to get used to it. I know that I feel like the election of Donald Trump was a direct backlash to the election of President Barack Obama. And so we're dealing with tensions that are going to come to a head pretty soon here. So I don't know.
So we have a last question, and this is for Commissioner Smith. This administration has informed their students that they've struggled to find resources in Montana to help educate and train faculty to be anti-racist in the classroom. Are there any specific resources that you would recommend to the faculty and administration to implement anti-racist policies at our law school? And I'm going to broaden that and say within the university as a whole.
There are plenty of resources. I think there are a lot of books out there on how to be an anti-racist. That's one of my favorites, I guess. And I think there are definitely diversity, equity, and inclusion organizations outside of the Montana Racial Equity Project. I feel like I'm plugging my own organization a lot, but there are DEI workshops all across the country that specifically deal with diversity and inclusion. And if it's something that you want to implement, then it's definitely an option for the university system as a whole.
I think I'm muted, but I think we are right at our allotted break time. So I'm going to hand it back to Daniel.
I appreciate our panelists once again for coming and speaking with us today about 13th, and I appreciate our moderator for facilitating that discussion. This was certainly a hard topic for me. Growing up, you know, we have the history classes that teach us about civil rights movements and different segments of Black history. So watching 13 for the first time this week, it was very, very interesting. I previously elected not to watch 13th because of the content. Sometimes it's hard seeing the images and being taken back to a time in which I experienced racial discrimination on part of state actors, specifically law enforcement in Orange County, California. And so this was a great discussion, and I'm glad that we had this opportunity to talk about this. One thing that stuck out to me on the economic piece that I thought was interesting was that many of these corporations hire or contract with prisons to have their prisoners do the work for them. And so in my mind, I was thinking, if we were able to provide these economic opportunities, these jobs outside of these prison labor contracts, it may have a big impact on you know, the mass incarceration. And so I just thought it was like very interesting that, you know, you don't get the job until you go to prison and you're forced to work at, you know, meaningless wages because of a contract, where if you were not in prison and you were able to have that job, you know, building those guidance systems and helping Victoria's Secret make their items before they ended their contract, or if you're in Idaho planting potatoes, you know, it's like, why can't I have this job outside of prison? Why is it so difficult for me to secure it then? So I thought that was just very interesting, because I know in the Black community, jobs and economics, they are a huge component in supporting the community, supporting your family. And when those economic opportunities are not available, then you get caught up in schemes like the crack cocaine, where you know, you had people in the inner city communities making this product that is otherwise foreign to the U.S. You know, Black individuals don't own any boats or any planes to bring in some of the opium that made a lot of the heroin and things. But it was just interesting to me that they would rather give the jobs while they're in prison than not. But before I digress too much further, we're going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break. So go ahead and scream if you have to, go outside and throw some snow in your face. We finally got some more, and we'll see you back here in about 15 more minutes when we start our second panel.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's now 2:30. And I can see some. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start off with the land acknowledgement. This is a very important piece of information that I wanted to share at the very beginning, but my nerves got the best of me. And so I wanted to present this information about the land acknowledgement and a bit more about ABIII's role. So the law school is on the traditional lands of indigenous peoples, including Silis, Senka, and Klispi. Many others, including the Blackfeet, Nez Perce, Shoshone, Bannock, and Coeur d'Alene, had and continue to have a crucial presence in the area. We acknowledge the role the legal system has played in the removal of indigenous peoples from these lands, and through our commitment to education, service, and scholarship, strive to improve the quality of justice for future generations. Doing so demands respect for tribal sovereignty and indigenous cultures, as well as accountability to the needs and perspectives of indigenous people, who from time immemorial to the present and until the end of time, protect and remain connected with this land on which we gather, live, learn, and work. And so I thank the Dean for putting the land acknowledgement up. And right now I want to introduce the organizers of our next panel so that we can move forward with today's programming. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Forster and Brittany Koontz.
Brittany, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first and ACLU?
Thank you. Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, so I'm Brittany Koontz, and I'm the current president of ACLU, and our group focuses on protecting the civil rights and liberties of individuals, especially those who have historically been denied their rights. And I just want to say thank you to Daniel and MBLSA for putting on this event, and thank you to our panelists and attendees for being here today. Thanks.
And my name is Liz Forster. I am the president of ELG, and ELG and ACLU collaborate on this event with BLSA, and we're really excited to have our panelists today. Unfortunately, our moderator got caught in some weather-related issues while traveling, so Daniel and I will be moderating, but we really encourage everyone to write some questions in the chat and engage, and we'll keep an eye on it so we can keep this very conversational. And our moderator, Nate Higgy, is a journalist from Mountain West News Bureau, and he recently put together a package of stories with some colleagues about fatal police encounters in the West, and in part their disproportionate impact on Native American communities. I'll try and insert as much as I can and use my former journalist experience to be able to insert some background in the conversation. But thankfully, we have two excellent panelists. First is Professor Clifford Villa. Professor Villa is a professor of environmental and constitutional law at the University of New Mexico School of Law. He served for 22 years as legal counsel for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, first with the EPA headquarters in DC, and later with the EPA regional offices in Denver and Seattle. Over his time, his EPA practice included administrative, civil, and criminal enforcement of federal laws, such as the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. For the last 8 years of his practice, Professor Villa served as legal officer for the EPA's Emergency Response Program, providing on-call legal assistance for federal responses to hazardous waste sites, oil spills, natural disasters, and other major concerns. Professor Villa is also the author of an environmental justice textbook, which Professor Zellner's Environmental Justice and Practice course is using, and it's an excellent book, and he provides a lot of really enlightening insights that I hope he'll be able to reflect on today. Our second panelist is Brian Burkhart, who is a journalist based in Reno, Nevada. Brian is a lifelong and award-winning journalist. He founded the website Fatal Encounters, which is an impartial, comprehensive, and searchable national database of people killed during interactions with police. His work was most recently featured in Nate and his colleagues' Mountain West News Bureau feature package. And we're excited to hear his reflections and be able to see how both environmental justice and fatal police encounters paint a larger picture on race in America. Daniel, anything before we start?
No, everything's fine.
Awesome. So I know I gave a little bit of an introduction, Professor Villa and Brian, to both of you, but would you like to just spend a minute or two each talking about some of your background and how it relates to each of your specialties? So Professor Villa, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thank you, Liz. And first, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to join you here. It is truly a pleasure. If it seems a bit unusual to be hearing from a professor in New Mexico in the bright desert on a snowy day here in Montana, let me just say that my heart is deeply placed in Montana in many ways. I spent a lot of time working there. I drove it end to end all over last year, researching stories, including a lot of time around Anaconda and other places as well. So, and I love spending time with all the professors there. So I was glad to join the environmental justice class earlier. My work with environmental justice really came out beginning with my practice at the EPA, where my job was mostly to enforce environmental laws and also doing work on emergency response, as Liz mentioned, like oil spills or disasters or kids playing with a bottle of mercury they found in a shed in the community. And time again, we would go into communities and they were almost always communities of color. You know, the richer neighborhoods of Seattle never seem to have the same problems as communities in Yakima, Washington, for example, a heavily Latino community on the east side of the mountains, or indigenous communities in every direction from Seattle or from Denver, or where I'm sitting today in Albuquerque. We are completely surrounded, and of course on indigenous lands. And we see these disparate impacts, and they're not a mistake, and it's not a coincidence. They're very historic and systemic reasons for that. And what we're seeing right now with COVID is really just bringing to the forefront these incredibly disparate impacts on particularly Black and Brown communities and indigenous communities, where people who are frontline workers are the most exposed and they're the least protected in many ways. So environmental justice was a natural outflow from doing environmental enforcement, from doing research. And the deeper and deeper we get into it, we find the central role of race. And I'm also privileged to be teaching constitutional rights, and where environmental law and constitutional law merge, I think that is the place for environmental justice. So thank you for having me. I look forward to some good conversation.
Thanks, Professor Villa. Brian, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and talk about your project? I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the reasons why you wanted to start it and some of the laws surrounding issues of reporting police encounters. You're still muted.
Okay. Well, this project began. I was the editor and publisher of the Reno News and Review, which was kind of the lefty paper in Reno, Nevada. And it was a Friday night, and I was driving home from work, and I passed this scene of just chaos, and I knew just instinctively that either a cop had killed somebody or somebody had killed a cop. And it just sparked a question in my mind, you know, how often does that happen? And, you know, I was a long-time investigative reporter, but I'd never really covered police topics before. So anyway, I just went home and I cracked a bottle of wine, and I was going to figure out, you know, sort of how often does this happen, particularly in Nevada. And it did not take me very long to realize that that nobody really knew, and that the data that was out there was you couldn't depend on it. And I'm going to truncate a sort of a long story into just a sentence, but the most commonly used data was the supplementary homicide reports that's put together by the FBI for the Uniform Crime Report. And I couldn't immediately get my hands on that, but when I did, I went straight to Florida because I have sort of a bias against Florida. I just think crazy things happen in Florida. And it turned out that the state of Florida had never participated in the supplementary homicide report, which meant that every year when the New York Times and the Washington Post and ABC News said, last year there were this many people killed by police in America, it was just a lie. Because they never disclosed that, less than 50%, well, far less than 50% of agencies were reporting. So it's sort of, I don't know, a light bulb went off, and it was 2012. The internet was new and blowing up, so I just figured I could collect that data and actually put it out there. And I was gonna. My original idea was to crowdsource public records requests. So the first data set we put together was all the 18,000 agencies that participated in the U.S. Census of state and local law enforcement agencies. And we came up with some boilerplate letters. Somebody else had actually created them, and we just linked to them. And so people, and it's still on the website. If you ever want to know who are the police agencies in your county, you can still look them up at fatalencounters.org. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to take so much of your time. We went. We had some success with that. For example, we made public records requests of all 1,700 agencies in the state of Texas. We also made public records requests of all the agencies in Nevada, because my year reporting on this story was based on Nevada stuff, not national. And I don't know, we did all it was 64, 65 United States agencies, but it collecting data that way turned out to be really slow. And also you'd get like a bill from, I think it was Fort Worth that sent us a bill for $35,000 to get access to their public data. There were several agencies in Texas that were over 15,000. I mean, police agencies have a whole variety of ways of preventing you from getting the public records you've asked for. Like some would say, send us a check for 23 cents. It just ways of delaying it. And part of that strategy is because most reporters don't have the luxury of an editor who says, okay, you can take a year just gathering data on the story. I mean, it only worked because I was the boss. So anyway, we ended up switching from that to sort of a crowdsourcing method after Michael Brown was killed. And once that happened and we started to gain some notoriety and we're on national news and stuff, we switched to paid researchers. And basically now it's, we've got several groups gathering data on different things, but I do the daily updates by myself, and that's about it.
Thank you both. Brian, I'm going to stick with you for a minute, but what was some of the, other than the difficulty of getting these records, what were kind of the standout findings that you had that, continue to propel this work, and maybe some of the issues that come from data gaps?
Well, all right. So one thing you have to understand is I do very little analysis myself. It's like I made a decision early on. Either I could gather the data and make it available to everyone else, or I could gather a little bit. It was just impossible to do analysis and reporting and gather the data. So, I mean, the bigger idea was to help people, journalists, academics in the United States, to be able to do their own data analysis. And I mean, it's still what we do. I mean, some of the big findings were, obviously that people of color are overrepresented in the data. you can't believe what a big question you just asked me. I've personally researched on the verge of 30,000 deaths during police interactions. So it's hard to sort of focus on the little parts of it.
Yeah, I did crime and breaking news when I was a reporter, and even sometimes it's sad, but you get lost in the sheer number that you're dealing with, that it's sometimes hard to look really micro.
It's sort of made me well, every bit of it's micro, actually. You know, I mean, we collect down to street address. So you guys, I'm not sure, maybe I'm talking over some people's heads. Fatal encounters, what we do is we track every death that happens when police are around. So that includes things like suicides, that includes car chases where the cop didn't kill somebody, but the person they were chasing killed some third party. So we would include that. We include off-duty misbehaviors like spousal abuse or murder. So it's everything. So we collect name, age, gender, a photo if we can, race, date, street address, city, state, zip code, county, agency, and then we have a short description. We have a link to news article or public record, police report, whatever we have. And we have a couple columns that are kind of experimental. One regarding mental illness and one regarding who decides justification in a community or what that process is. And I'm just in the midst of adding 4 threat assessment columns that analyze things like, was the person armed? What were they armed with? For example, when I was looking at yesterday, the guy was armed with a flip-flop. Were they fleeing? And did they make a physical movement that could be determined to be a threat, or did the police say that there was a physical movement that they perceived as a threat?
Thank you. Professor
So
Villa,
it's really small and it's really big.
Professor Villa, I kind of want to ask a similar question about the challenges with reporting procedures, or if they are inadequate, and how you get around that when it's particularly impacting communities of color or communities that don't have the resources to be able to rally the funds to deal with it on their own. Did you encounter any of that at the EPA or after?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is one that I'm also looking into now. I don't make any effort to do the kind of quantitative work that Brian has done, but there are many good sources on different issues by different organizations. One of the questions that I've been looking into very recently, actually for the last couple of years, is the fatality number from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. People may remember it was an absolutely devastating event, a direct strike on the island of Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017. And after all of that, well, massive blackout, the longest blackout in American history. People went 6 months and still may be without power. But the question was, how many people died as a consequence of Hurricane Maria? According to FEMA, the official death count from Maria was 64 people. And you knew that couldn't possibly be. That is still the official number, 64 from FEMA. There was later a study by the Harvard School of Public Health that went back and did their own analysis. And according to their number, it was over 4,600. A third study that came out last year placed it maybe closer to 1,400. And how is it possible to have that great of a fluctuation in just determining the death toll from one event? And the answer is, and with direct relevance now to COVID, it's not just one event that may cause the impact. If FEMA goes out on the island and only finds 64 bodies, which is basically what they're doing, they declare that's good enough. But what they're not looking at are all the consequences of the hurricane. The two biggest causes of death after Hurricane Maria were heart disease and diabetes. It knocked out electricity, it knocked out refrigeration, it knocked out the ability to maintain insulin, it knocked out heart medicine, it knocked out machines, and people died not because a roof fell on top of them, but for the simple reasons that they couldn't get their insulin, they couldn't get their dialysis, they couldn't get things they needed to continue living after the first 48 hours. And so that's why it may be difficult to say what was the impact of this event. Because it's not as simple as going around and counting the bodies that the day after the hurricane blows through. And that tells us that all the estimates for deaths from COVID and anything else are really an estimate. And, lawyers don't have to do this kind of work, but we do have to be critical of the reports that we read and read it with a grain of salt and ask the logical questions. Well, what are they counting for these numbers? And then what are they not counting, or how are they counting it? And who is counting it? You would think that the Harvard School of Public Health is a pretty reliable source, but they're still doing estimates, and those estimates will continue to be refined. So I'm actually right now, I have a tracker from Johns Hopkins has a COVID death tracker, and you see those numbers, and we pushed over 400,000 fatalities a couple of weeks ago. Well, I'm sure it is much more than 400,000 when we look back at what the real costs and impacts were. There are good sources out there. I encourage law students, they're doing research, to use the best research out there and question it and continue to use your own critical analysis to say, all right, what are they counting? What are they not counting?
Yeah, and on that note, Professor Villa, how do you see this inadequate reporting potentially impacting communities of color, whether it's Puerto Rico or elsewhere, either more so or in a different way than more affluent white communities, if you've seen that?
It's a question I'm sort of struggling with, and it goes actually towards the definition of environmental justice, which we sort of understood in the early 1980s is really focused on racial minorities and low-income communities. And I think it starts there, and it certainly centers there. But again, if you look at the impacts of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, it would be easy to say, who are the most impacted people? Puerto Ricans. But that doesn't really tell you anything. When you look at, well, who among Puerto Ricans were most affected and why, then you start to get the answers to questions. If you look at the impacts of COVID now in Louisiana, you see an extraordinary impact on Black Americans. Why? Well, many reasons. One, they don't have the luxury like we do of sitting in and doing work by Zoom because they're delivering food, because they're taking care of all the things that we need. But also, among other reasons, because they don't have access to health care that we may have. Also because their respiratory systems were already compromised before the pandemic. They're living in places with bad air. Their lungs already were impacted. They don't have the sort of resilience that other people might have in a place with cleaner air. And so we sort of know these ideas, but now we're really getting empirical. We're getting better and better data linking bad air to the impacts of COVID, job lines and vocations to COVID, access to healthcare and COVID. It's not enough to say race, yes or no. It's really why? Why are these things happening? And there's going to be a lot of work, and people are doing a lot of good work in that area.
Thank you. Brian, I want to ask you something about a comment you made earlier about Michael Brown, the shooting of Michael Brown impacting the way you all collected data at Fatal Encounters. Could you talk about that a little bit more? And if you have any reflections on some of the, I think, headline fatal police shootings of people of color and how that has potentially influenced any of your work, I'd love to hear about that.
Well, the main thing that Michael Brown affected for us was I'd started in 2012, so I was our people. I mean, we weren't even fatalencounters.org really. We were just some people do it with a hobby. We were the only group that had a year's worth of real data. So the FBI, you know, you could go to the supplementary homicide report, or you could go back to, you know, what was available of the arrest-related death reports and look at what they had. But where we were looking at about 1,200 people being killed by police or being killed during police interactions, you know, they were saying it was about 350 in the official stuff. So we got, like I said, we developed a little notoriety. As a result of the protests after Michael Brown, they reinstituted the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act. I think it came in it was just about a year later. It was re-upped for authorization. I don't know. When I got into it, you know, it was kind of a suspicion. I mean, people of color knew in Ferguson, for example, that cops were harassing them, were treating them differently, but there weren't any real indisputable numbers because, you know, the federal government, I believe, didn't want you to know. In fact, I see many things that suggest that they still don't want you to know. For example, they just started their new National Use of Force reporting database. They had their first publication earlier last year, and they released no data. What they released was the participating agencies. So that's a year without data from the federal government. If we weren't collecting, I mean, the Washington Post also, they collect people who die at gunshots. If those weren't happening, we'd be getting no information out of the federal government. And there's no state governments that I don't want to say there's no. Oh no, Texas does actually a pretty good job with their the Attorney General has their deaths in custody reporting. But we would have no federal information, and you know, I'm hopeful that with the new administration, some of these things can be reformed. For example, the National Use of Force database could use individuals from 50 states, you know, paid individuals, or, you know, the Department of Justice has all the money in the world. They could afford to hire, you know, 50 people to do what, if one person can do it, 50 people can do it 50 times as well. And they would have the sort of the government support to ask police agencies to provide data about shots that didn't kill somebody, which is very important. I mean, one of the things that I try to explain to people, but they don't really get it. And so maybe somebody here will get it. A gunshot is the most analyzed thing a law enforcement officer can do. If they kill somebody, that's going to go through multiple levels of investigation. So if you want to see how police impact people of color differently than they impact white people, look at the intention where they did not intend to kill somebody, where it was just everyday abuse. And you will see that Black people aren't just overrepresented in the data. Like for gunshots, I think Black people in the United States are about 13%. And so they're represented at about 26%, which is huge. But in some of those instances, like asphyxiation or taserings, you'll find that they aren't just overrepresented in the numbers. There are actually more people who die during those more Black people specifically who die during those interactions than white people. I mean, it's just, it's not reported, but if you want to see the real racism where it's obvious but sort of hidden, look at those numbers where they didn't intend to kill somebody. And you will see that it's plain as the nose on your face. Another thing, I mean, we're talking about you're on indigenous lands. My feeling is that Native Americans who are killed at the hands or during interactions with law enforcement are the most sort of misrepresented in the data, and they're not represented at 100% because there's typically very little media, like news media, that concentrate on reservations, and the federal government who typically are in charge of law enforcement on those reservations are the worst about reporting it. I mean, it's amazing how the Freedom of Information Act, which is a federal law, you know, people use it to talk about all states, but it's a federal law. They just completely ignore it. They don't respond to your stuff. If they do, I mean, I was in Alabama and I got a call from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. And they said, "Are you still interested in this public records request you made?" It was a request I made in 2012. So it was like 7 years later, they were responding to my thing. I mean, just those factors make it also, often Native Americans are misrepresented as either being Hispanic or as white. So that tends to decrease numbers. Those mistakes are made with Native Americans that aren't, you know, typically made with other groups. It's I think our numbers numbers of Native Americans are really just bad, and they're the best that exist. So there you go.
Professor Villa, I had a question also following up with Brian's comment there. The timing of it all. Having someone call back years later to ask if you're still interested in research information is appalling. And so my question for you, Professor Villa, is when it comes to environmental justice and marginalized communities, do you see a lack or a delay in response to their environmental concerns?
Well, of course, that's a good question. Yes, yes, but it's often even more challenging than that, because I think that a lot of communities of color may have rational reasons for not engaging with the government, for not asking for help, for not inviting the feds to descend upon their community. And I think we need to do a much better job at thinking about who is being served and who is not being served, who is being heard and who is not being heard. You know, most people would not know how to file a FOIA request. They wouldn't even get as far as thinking that there's a law that requires the government to give us money. And then, of course, they're going to find the sad realization that even if they do know how to file a FOIA request, it could take 8 years or more to get things in. You know, I think that's why it's so important to be thinking about these issues now, to be training law students about there are ways to get information. There are laws that encourage providing information, but also as a clinical professor, I'm teaching in the clinic now, I would say file a FOIA request, and we do that almost every semester, and then get to know who are the people that actually have the information that you need. Can you get it with a phone call? Can you get it with an email? Can you get it, you know, pre-COVID by just going down to the office and hanging out long enough that you become a nuisance and someone gives you a report? You know, I was in government long enough to know that I would try to respond to a FOIA in 20 days or 30 days, but things do get lost, and sort of squeaky wheels get, you know, get attention. And if you're representing a client, you need to find a way to get the information in a useful manner. whether it's because there's a statute or because you have a friend or some other route. So these are big challenges, but my challenge mostly as a federal attorney was even making contact with communities and building relationships with trusted people in those communities, because they wouldn't ask for information. They had very good reasons for not engaging in a lot of legal systems. And that's a thing we really need to work on.
Professor, yeah, I kind of want to keep going along those lines of making contacts and building trust with communities. Every student at AB3 is in a position of privilege to be getting this legal knowledge and to be moving forward with it to hopefully represent communities that might not have had representation in the past. How do you build those connections and build that trust in a way that's not shallow or seemingly like a publicity statement, or I don't know quite the right word to use, but hopefully you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think all those concerns are very important. I think it begins with people in the communities themselves. And if you happen to be based in Missoula and you really need to reach out to someone in some rural community, find someone in that community that you can work with. I think in your class, I gave you the example of, I found an immediate need for talking to someone in Yakima, Washington. And I found an attorney in the legal aid office who didn't know anything about environmental law, but she was a trusted voice in that community. Sometimes it's a faith-based leader. Sometimes it's, someone on the local government, but someone from that community who's already established and becomes a conduit for information and for exchange, because it just doesn't work to say, I'm here, how can I help? You do need to take time to build those relationships. I feel like I'm doing that right now in New Mexico. I was born and raised in New Mexico, but that doesn't give me any special entry into a lot of the pueblos that are all around us, and many other communities. It time and time again, you work with the community, people who are already there, and understand that things do take time. That a first phone call is not going to get the information that you need. You shouldn't expect that. But over time, consistency, delivering results, those are the things that help us build those relationships.
So I have a sort of a constitutional law question here. So we've talked about the delays in reporting and the inaccuracies in reporting and voluntary reporting and the issues with that. And we've also talked about the disparity between the environmental, the environment of marginalized communities. So my next question surrounds the prison conditions and the right for inmates to bring challenges to have these conditions improved. For example, in 2014, California State Prison was fined $600,000 for spilling 220 gallons of raw sewage into a nearby creek that protected a marine sanctuary. And they were fined in 2015 and 2017 as well for not properly cleaning it up. And so when it comes to things like this and folks getting sick, what are their individual rights when it comes to suing the government to change these instances of toxic pollution that are hurting prisoners and their communities?
Well, I'd say in the first instance, the burden shouldn't fall on the prisoners to fix the problem with the prison. I mean, that is directly the responsibility of the prison bureau, and whoever is the owner and operator of that. And there are laws that could be enforced to fix that. As an EPA attorney, a lot of my work was based around federal facilities enforcement. Who are the worst polluters in the United States? It turns out it's the United States. It's the US Navy, it's the US Air Force, it's the US Army, it's the Department of Energy, it's the Bureau of Prisons. They are all responsible for complying with the law. And the law is very clear in the same manner, in the same extent as any private party. But there needs to be someone to enforce that law. And the people who enforce that law could be the EPA, it could be the state of Montana, or it could be citizen suits. Understanding the law, though, is power. I mean, and that's where you come in. You could be helping prisoners by bringing a citizen suit. You could do it as a state AG. You could do it as a federal attorney. But we shouldn't rely on people who are already on the receiving end of these things to think that now they have to learn the law, navigate the system. That's just not the way the law is set up. But if they have to do that, if the prisoners themselves have to sort of take matters into their own hand, then they should have some organizations who can advocate for them. Can this be something that a legal aid office takes on? Can this be something that an environmental organization like Earth Justice takes on? I think that there are prisoner advocacy groups that could be building those sort of relationships. The ACLU is doing terrific work now in environmental justice, particularly after the drinking water contamination in Flint. But it takes people with sort of certain abilities to navigate those systems to understand the power of law. And of course, there are good people inside who, begin doing things pro se, but it's really not their responsibility. That burden should not be on them. They should be finding allies and working with those allies, and the allies should be working with them.
Thank you, Professor Villa. Brian, we have a question from an audience member for you. Going back to when you were talking about the federal government's newest report, the National Use of Force database, and you mentioned that it didn't really contain any data. And our audience member is asking, how do they work around reporting the actual numbers? What does the government argue in response to the claim that they don't want to know the actual numbers?
I don't know what to argue, but I can tell you in this case, everybody was anxiously awaiting the first report out of that database. And the last time they did a U.S. Census of State and Local Law Enforcement Agencies in the United States was 2008, and they're mandated to do it every 4 years. So at that time, there were about 18,000. I've done some work with ORI numbers, which are individual numbers that identify different police departments. So I think it's probably closer to 22,000. But anyway, they're all supposed to be participating in this. Of course, it's voluntary because for various reasons. So only 6,000 participated. So about call it 25%. So all they did instead of releasing the data was they released the names to the agencies that participated. And then so they came up with this sort of draconian method. They say, okay, when we get 60% of participation, we'll release this data. And when we get 80% of participation, we'll release all the data. The problem is in the United States, in the supplementary homicide reports or the deaths in custody reporting, there has never been 80% participation. So there's no reason to imagine that because they came up with this magic number that we'll ever see any data or ever see the majority of the data out of that database. So what's their argument? Their argument was, well, we made it voluntary and there was such poor participation, we can't tell you because it would be misleading. It's just baloney, to say kindly.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience member for Professor Villa. Professor Villa, you mentioned citizen suits and, heeding the words, the reflections you had on it shouldn't be, the prisoner's job to take on this responsibility, but what do the citizen suits look like? How does that process work? Building a suit procedurally, going through it. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm a little distracted at this moment. I just got notice that I've been awarded tenure and promotion at my school.
Congratulations!
And I'm getting a zillion text messages starting with the dean. But
if you'd like to take
I think this means that I get to say absolutely anything in my head now with tenure. Is that what this means?
I can come back to you if you want to take a moment to celebrate that amazing achievement.
No. I promised my wife we will celebrate this. Citizen suits. There are federal laws that specifically provide for citizen suits, like the Clean Water Act. If a prison is discharging pollutants into some wetland or water, that's without a permit, that's a straight up violation of the Clean Water Act. And prisoners or anyone who might be injured by that would have standing to sue and would have a right to sue under citizen suit provisions. You provide notice of intent to sue, you wait 60 days. If they don't fix the problem, you file a civil complaint, you can go and do discovery and all of that. The Clean Water Act has been a particularly powerful tool for citizen suits, and they almost always settle because the violations are almost always very clear. They either had a permit or they didn't have a permit. The Clean Air Act is sometimes harder to prove that they emitted something into the air, but they can be powerful. They disposed of some hazardous waste. There are federal laws and state analogs that have explicit citizen suit provisions in them. Sometimes they also provide for a recovery of attorney fees as well. A very, very powerful form of environmental enforcement. And also just keep this in mind that what I found is that particularly going after US Navy bases and Army bases, nobody wants to have a citation on their career record. If you're the guy who's like the warden of a prison and you just were cited for violation of the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act, regardless of how much it's going to cost to fix it, it's sort of a blight on your record, and that's sort of the end of your career. So, there may be many different ways, and publicity, does anybody ever have access to go to the press on these things? There may be many ways to generate that sort of pressure, short of going all the way to a trial on the merits and that sort of thing as well. But when you know the laws, there are some very powerful tools that can be used to fix problems, and make things better, and hopefully send a message that this kind of behavior is not going to be okay to continue.
And just to keep you from celebrating a little bit more, I just want to ask you about a recent Greenpeace article that was published talking about, I'm going to look up the exact number. According to a 2016 report, at least 598 federal and state prisons are located within 3 miles of a Superfund site, with 134 of them just 1 mile away. And I know you mentioned to me in private that this was a pretty incredible piece for you. So I just wanted to ask some of your initial thoughts on that, and potentially any patterns it falls into that you've seen within environmental justice.
Well, yeah, it was a very interesting report to begin reading this morning. I really appreciate that you brought it to my attention, but it is very consistent with sort of the pattern of environmental injustice that we have seen across this country from the beginning. Where are heavy industrial facilities cited? Well, they're not cited in my nice neighborhood, or likely yours, are cited in low-income minority communities. Prisons are sort of an industry, as you saw in the film. They produce things, among other things, when they're doing any kind of production, they produce pollution. And if you look at them as sort of a polluting facility, it's no surprise when they're cited in rural communities, when they're cited in poor communities and minority communities, alongside almost anything else, like a cement plant, an asphalt plant, an oil refinery. All these things are cited where they are because there's, among other things, a lack of political capital to oppose citing in these neighborhoods. Another thing that it reminds me of is there are many housing complexes that are also cited in these heavily polluted areas. And people get trapped in these communities too, because there's no place else they could afford to live. And so they really feel like, why don't they just move away from that polluting facility? Well, because they didn't have the money to do that. And we need to understand that our business is protecting people wherever they live, whoever they are. And that includes prisoners. Wherever they live, whoever they are, we need to protect their health as well.
Thank you. Brian, I had another question for you, kind of on the lines of, I guess, similar to citizen suits, but what can an individual do? I mean, I know you have data collection that you can get from citizens, but but really, what is kind of the role of the individual in trying to create a more comprehensive picture of fatal police shootings, if there is one?
Good question. I think the only thing that needs to happen is people need to be aware that that just because it doesn't happen every day in their own community doesn't mean it doesn't happen about 8 times a day across the United States. You know, do you want to live in a government where or live in a country where the government can kill people with no transparency, never say what their name is, never answer to the public about whether it's okay for the government to kill people, its own citizens? I think just being aware is pretty much all most people need to do.
Can I add to that? I really appreciate that comment. And I'm not a statistician. I don't do a lot of quantitative analysis, but what I do a lot is field work. I travel, I talk to people, I take pictures. And that is one reason why I actually crossed the entire state of Nevada last fall, east to west, north to south. And after I crossed the entire state of Montana, I went into North Dakota and I talked to people on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. I went into Minneapolis and I visited this site where George Floyd was killed. And I also continued all around the Midwest. Eventually I made my way to Ferguson and I visited the memorial where Michael Brown was killed. And in every instance, it just seems like a normal neighborhood. Exactly what Brian is saying. I mean, it's not, this neighborhood where people get shot. It's your neighborhood. It's where people live. There is nothing that seems like truly unusual about the corner where George Floyd was murdered. There's a grocery store, there's a community theater, there's a community garden. And where Michael Brown was killed, it's like some nice apartments, landscaping, and open place for kids to play. These are people who are being affected, who are being targeted. And, whatever you think about the numbers, just think this could easily be your neighborhood. And it could easily be my daughter, who is the very same age as Michael Brown when he was killed. I do worry about those things. And there are communities and we need to protect all of them. And when you get on the ground, you see these things, you just can't say, oh, well, that's not me. Well, it could be. Next time, my daughter, my son.
You.
Yeah, I kind of think about that in the context of climate change, where natural disasters are going to be impacting almost every single community, if not every community. And you start to have that realization of like, oh, it now is in my neighborhood. And how, if you're thinking just in a very narrow climate change focused, science, atmospheric science of what's going on, how do you transplant that to, how do I empathize with other communities that maybe have been experiencing this for a decade, for 2 decades, for, trying to understand what Hurricane Katrina was like for people who were trapped there. And I guess maybe that comes down to that empathy that both of you are reflecting on, of trying to understand, it's not happening in my neighborhood today, but what is it like to be in a neighborhood where people are just trying to live their lives with their families, and just like I am.
At one time I thought I was safe because I didn't live on the Gulf Coast, right? Oh, we don't have hurricanes in New Mexico, but then we have fires and we have smoke, and we don't even have enough trees in New Mexico, but we have smoke that's coming in from the West Coast from fires in California. I mean, we are all connected. We are all, we live or die together in some ways, and we need to be thinking about how we're going to keep each other safe, everyone, wherever you live and whoever you are.
So I grew up in a place called Falls City, Nebraska, which is literally the middle of nowhere. It's about 100 miles in between Lincoln, Omaha, and Kansas City. So, and I'd been doing this project for about 4 years. And all of a sudden I see somebody I know that had been killed not 2 blocks from where I grew up. Ann Snow was her name, and she was trying to get, I'm sorry, the word is blanking. What's the drug you take to get off heroin? You know, they send you to these clinics. Methadone.
It's
Methadone. So she was trying to get some methadone, and somehow a deputy sheriff had heard of the thing and accidentally killed her. I don't even know why his gun was out, but it was ruled justified in Falls City, Nebraska. So part of what was sort of funny about it was I'd been on you know, national news, in New York Times, on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and my dad or my family never bothered to mention, oh, Ann Snow was killed like right over there. It's crazy. Anyway, so yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I certainly agree that the awareness component is crucial when addressing these issues and trying to solidify change agents. But also, I think that remedy component with the government is also important. Why? Because when you know, state actors in the course of their work violate our constitutional rights, you know, there is a civil remedy, or there's supposed to be one at least. And I think when law enforcement are not held accountable, or just state actors generally, even when it comes to environmental issues, when there's no way to hold these agencies and their leaders accountable, it leaves a sense of, for me, lawlessness, in that others can do what they like or even make the mistake and it be justified, even though the situation clearly indicates that it was not justified, and sort of bending these rules so that there is no remedy. I think that is certainly a dangerous situation that a country like ours will find itself in, if in fact in the future there will not be an avenue for recourse for people of color, or just American citizens generally, when state actors violate their constitutional rights.
I agree. You know, I love teaching constitutional rights because I really want people to understand sort of the nature of them and how important they are. But one of the unfortunate circumstances of the way that our constitutional law has developed, it's really hard to prove, for example, that someone violated your right to equal protection. You have to actually prove intent to discriminate, as you might have heard. Even so, I still encourage my students to think hard about proving that case, proving hard cases, using all the kind of factors that we might use to sniff out discrimination, like, are they treating people differently? Is there a variation from the pattern? Did they actually talk about discriminating out loud? You know, I'm collecting all these unfortunate examples of the last 4 years. We had a president who intended a Muslim ban. And so, you know, it is possible sometimes to actually prove direct violations of the Constitution. It is hard, though. And because it's so hard, I always encourage students to think, is there a statutory remedy? Can you use the Civil Rights Act? Can you use the Clean Water Act? Can you use any other tool, even shaming them in public, to change behavior? Because there must be a solution to these continuing problems. And as much as I love to preach the Constitution, as much as I love it, it may not be the thing that we can rely on all the time.
Professor Villa, I wish I had another hour to ask you about Civil Rights Act and environmental justice, because I did a project on some of it last semester. But in the interest of time, we had one question, and then we'll move to kind of final thoughts. And this was for Professor Villa, and this actually relates directly to government accountability, and how you see the recent criminal charges, as well as settlements for the Flint water crisis as being, do you see that as a step forward towards reparations and environmental justice, or how do you kind of perceive that as a means of healing, if it's that?
That's a really good question. I'm sorry that sounds like a cliche, but one I have really been wrestling with ever since sort of the Flint drinking water crisis came to light. I would say that the criminal prosecutions, multiple indictments, including against the former governor, and multiple indictments for, among other things, manslaughter against the former head of the state health agency, are a good step towards a form of justice, criminal justice, but they're sort of backwards. What has happened in Flint is the poisoning of a generation of kids. Lead poisoning has permanent effects on the neurological developments of young brains, and that will never be remedied. That will never be fixed. The best they could do is follow these kids and provide them with special needs as they get through law school and occupational therapy as they hopefully graduate from high school. But I spent a lot of time working in mining communities like the Coeur d'Alene Basin around Kellogg, like Butte and Anaconda, and we know what lead does. We know what lead does to children's brains, and it can't be fixed. It must be prevented. It should have been prevented. It could have so easily been prevented. There is a law, the Safe Drinking Water Act is a law that made what they did illegal, and it wasn't enforced. And worse, when the violations came to light, everybody ends up pointing fingers at each other. So the state of Michigan required an emergency manager to switch the water source from the safe drinking water it was getting from Detroit to literally the Flint River. And they knew the Flint River was contaminated, and they knew the pipes were made of lead, and they knew kids were drinking it. And the state of Michigan knew, the governor's office knew, and nobody did anything. And then EPA Region 5, which has jurisdiction over Michigan, also knew. The head of the regional office knew and attempted to sort of savage her chemical engineer who sort of brought these issues to light. Everybody tried to deny responsibility, and they should go to jail. They absolutely poison people, you shoot people, they should go to jail. But it doesn't help the kids. It doesn't help the kids. It did take a lot of civil litigation, class action suits. There were lawsuits under Civil Rights Act, Section 1983. There were also good old-fashioned tort actions led by the ACLU. There was litigation in federal court and state court, and all of it did sort of merge into the $600 million settlement that you might hear of today. And it's great to have that money, but where's it going to go? Well, it's going to be a lifetime of medical expenses. It's going to be a lifetime of occupational therapy, and you're never going to fix those brains. So it's great to have a settlement, but we have to prevent this. We have to prevent it next time. And if it's too late for Flint, I actually visited Flint last fall too, and they're still on bottled water. Nobody's ever going to trust. Nobody's ever going to trust that city water. What's next? What can we do to stop this from happening again in the next town? That's your job.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of what this conversation has highlighted is one thing that's going to help prevent it is more reporting and more data and more access to data, I guess, is really, really a lot of the crux of this. Having FOIA requests be substantial. So we're a bit over time, so I just wanted to offer Brian and Professor Villa an opportunity for final thoughts. Brian, would you like to go first?
Oh, yeah, I don't have that many, you know, I haven't developed any wisdom from this project. I would encourage people not to think about these deaths as we saw with George Floyd, as being gunshot deaths, you know, good guy versus bad guy, just like in the movies. You know, sometimes I think the reality is following the fiction in some ways. Yeah, that's about what I got. I mean, just understand that you may have some idea of what this deadly police violence looks like, but what you think is probably wrong. And I say that because I know as much as anybody about it. And I know I'm wrong all the time. So, you know, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great.
Not very deep.
Good critical thought. Professor Villa?
Well, what you think is probably wrong if you're relying on other people to give you that information. I would say one thing to think about is be the person on the inside. Be the person on the inside who chooses to do the right thing. Be the agency attorney. Be that guy. Be that person who has a choice. Do I go home now, or do I actually think about this report I just got about lead contamination in the drinking water of Flint? Do I do something? Do something. Be that person. Stand up. Because these things are really hard to fix. And many times you can't fix them. I think one of the things that I'm most proud of, it doesn't appear anywhere in my tenure file, is after Flint came to light, I went back to my old office at EPA and I told them this story. I said, you are those people. You have that chance right now to stop this, to do better, to take your job seriously. Do better. That's what I say to all of you, wherever you are, if you're in a private firm, if you're in the government, if you're in academia, when you see something and you think this is a big problem, then maybe it's a really big problem. And maybe it's one you should take seriously and do something.
Well, thank you both. Selfishly, I had a wonderful time engaging in this conversation and hope that others feel the same. And thank you so much for taking your time, both the panelists and everyone who attended on this Friday afternoon. Daniel, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, so again, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. As our panelists just said at the very end, do better, do better. That's one thing that we can all do in our careers, in our profession, in our lives, is just commit to be the best person that we can be every day and to do our jobs as though other lives are relying on it, which is oftentimes the case. But I also want to say that if you're all full from Grubhub, you can thank SBA here at ABIII for their sponsorship of that. So please think about them with every chew that you have. If you're intellectually full, you can thank our panelists and moderators for a great event and for allowing us an opportunity to get into the minds of their experience and enlighten us with some solutions to some very serious problems that we have to deal with. Last one, my love and appreciation goes out to all of our collaborators and those who supported MBLSA, MPILC, ELG, ACLU, NLG, NALSA support, of course, SBA and ABIII School of Law for helping with coordinating this event and ensuring that it take place. So thank you all again. And this certainly isn't the end of the discussion. There are a couple more events that we will have towards the end of this month, and I believe ACLU and some other groups are also planning on doing some Black History Month activities. So stay tuned to those emails in your calendars, people. All right, that's all that I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Great job. And thank you, Christina and Dan Norton, for all of the back end work on this. Great job, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for having me, you guys. See you next time.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Professor Villa.
And congratulations, Cliff. I don't think I got him.
He's gone. Oh, that was so classic.
That was perfect.
It was just
See you guys.
Take care. Thank you,
Liz.
Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Great job, all. Thanks. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, you too.